Hello, welcome to this Bible study on the book of Ruth. This is the first part. If you are joining us and you're not a member of St Andrew's congregation, then just to let you know that this is not a university course. I am not a university professor. I am a vicar of a local parish church. Really, all the information I have, other than a few of my own thoughts, will have come from various books that I've read and articles. I will give a list of those books and articles in the text at the end of the video. So, the Book of Ruth, I think, an absolutely gorgeous little gem of a short Bible narrative. Sometimes described as a novella, that is a brief fictional story with characters and dialogue playing the most important part in that. So it fits very well on the stage. You could easily dramatise something like this. It apparently has the highest ratio of dialogue of any book in the Old Testament. It's also, of course, a very sort of feminine book, and some would say feminist. Only Ruth and Esther are Old Testament. They're the only two Old Testament books that are named after women, and in both cases they are the heroine of the story. It's a book with a very high quality of writing. It is said to be lyrical, and although it does use some unusual versions of the Hebrew, some of which might have been old-fashioned at the time or associated more with local dialects. The story itself, of course, is set in ancient Israel. We haven't quite got to the stage of a kingdom. This is a place that's still ruled by judges that have been appointed. And Israel is, of course, surrounded by other little sort of nations, embryonic nations. The most important in the case of this story, of course, being Moab. Moab comes about, apparently, according to the Bible, it is the fruit of Lot's incest with his daughters in Genesis 19. That's verses 30 to 38. So that Lot was Abraham's nephew. If you were to read through Genesis, you'll find that he sort of splits away from the main tribal group and heads off east. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about after the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah, and when Lot has headed off into the hill country on his own with his daughters, sort of fleeing that area. So this is Genesis 19:30 to 38. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. On the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Look, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son, and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son, and named him Ben-Ammi. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. So Moab goes on to become a close but frequently difficult neighbour to Israel. Although it sometimes is positive later on as well in the story of Israel and Judah. It is a place where David fled for protection and sent his parents for safety. At one point, it is incorporated into the Davidic kingdom, 2 Samuel 8.2, but later broke free in the reign of Ahab's son Ahaziah, 2 Kings 3:4-5, and was then on after was said to be a thorn in Israel's side. It was a kingdom, a nation that Israel despised for the reason that it is said that the Moabites would not give Israel water when they were wandering in the desert and in search of their promised land. But also, based on this story of Lot and his daughters, it had a reputation in Israel for being a kingdom of low morals, full of women who would seduce and full of kind of bad sexual ethics. So I've said just before that Ruth is set in the time of Judges. It's very clear about that at the very beginning of the narrative. But it looks back on that period, so it must have been written at least probably in the time of Kings. I'm not going to get into all the complexities, arguments of when exactly it was written, but obviously it ends with the ancestral tree up to King David. So we assume that it has to be written at least at the time of Kings, maybe later, but looks back at the time of Judges. And it sits as a sort of a beautiful linking book between those two periods and quite literally in the Bible, between the book of Judges and then Samuel, and which is possibly why traditionally it's believed to have been written by the prophet Samuel, but that's probably very unlikely. What is lovely is that after the turbulence of the book of Judges, suddenly the story opens out in Ruth into sort of this pastoral idyll, this scene of harvest time with ordinary people. It is sort of technically a comedy, if you like. There are no baddies at all in the story, which is pretty unusual really for the Old Testament. No one can really be identified as a baddie in this. At the end of Judges, it finishes by saying that in those days there was no king in Israel and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. And so that possibly gives us a clue as to why initially, at least in Ruth, things are going wrong, that people have turned away from God, they're doing things their own way, and possibly that the famine at the beginning and some of the deaths are a consequence of that, people following their own path, quite literally. There are similarities in some other accounts that come before Ruth of women like Ruth who are of another tribe, of another nation, that in some way affect the lineage of Israel, usually with some kind of sort of bed trick going on, or someone acting as some sort of surrogate. So it's well worth looking at the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38. Tamar dresses as a prostitute and she tricks Judah into sleeping with her. Again, it's another story of sort of separation, disaster, and then only hope through a woman finding redemption. Like I say, this sort of bed trick, a celebration, a Leverite union, and we'll come on to that in a minute, but a particular kind of a marriage takes place. Again, it's well worth looking again at the story of Hagar, a foreign handmaid who becomes the surrogate to continue the family line. And perhaps also Rahab, although not in the Davidic lineage, is a foreign woman who protects the line and converts to the nation of Israel, as it were. A sort of a harlot becoming a heroine sort of a story. Interestingly, the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible is placed among the writings. It's part of a group of 5 texts called the Megilloth. That is the scrolls. The others are the Song of Songs, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentation. And all those books of the scrolls, were associated, or are still associated, with one of the annual Jewish feasts. In Ruth's case, it's the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, which is an agricultural festival associated with fertility. Interestingly, also, it's supposedly the time when between the 2 harvests, when King David was born, and also the same period that he died, between the barley and the wheat harvests. And that perhaps is why the book leads up to King David. That's, of course, the very last line of the book. It's probably Ruth is associated with that festival, that time period, because of course that's when the story happens, between the times of the barley and the wheat harvests. But the other interesting thing is that the Feast of Weeks is also associated with the giving of the law at Sinai. And as we will discover, there's a lot to talk about in terms of law and the book of Ruth. And there's many ways to look at it. Is it that Ruth is the perfect proselyte who submits herself to the law, or are we intended to meditate on the law in a different way through the story? Talking of those laws, there are 3 really important ones which I think we probably have to have some understanding of before we get into reading the story. So the first law is a law about gleaning, that is, leaving a portion of your crop, or that which is spilt, for the less fortunate to collect. And that law comes from Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verses 19 to 22. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you beat your olive trees, do not strip what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. So what is particularly relevant to our story is that widows come in that sort of group of unfortunates, of people at the bottom of society, along with the alien and the orphan. The second law that we're going to look at is Leverate Marriage. This comes from Deuteronomy 25, 5 to 10. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, Then his brother's widow shall go up to the elders at the gate and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare, This is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Throughout Israel his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. Pretty dramatic stuff. So there's a real responsibility here. It's certainly not seen as a jolly taking on another wife or your brother's widow, but a serious responsibility, and one which, if it's not taken up, should involve great shame. When a man dies childless, his brother should have a child by the widow in order to provide an heir for the dead man. So it's hard to get our modern heads round, but essentially the first child then of that new union, of the Leverate union, technically belongs to the dead man. It does him honour and continues his line. In this case, Ruth's husband Mahlon, who we're going to come to in the story, or possibly is it Elimelech, her father-in-law, who's being honoured and whose line continued. When Ruth has a son, interestingly, at the end, we will get there, but it says that the son is born to Naomi, her mother-in-law. Okay, so the third law, and almost certainly the most complicated, needs some legal minds on this one, that's for sure, is the law of redemption. And that's found in Leviticus 25, 23 to 28, and 47 to 55. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. Throughout the land that you hold, you shall provide for the redemption of the land. If any one of your kin falls into difficulty and sells a piece of property, then the next of kin shall come and redeem what the relative has sold. If the person has no one to redeem it, but then prospers and finds sufficient means to do so, the years since its sale shall be computed, and the difference shall be refunded to the person to whom it was sold, and the property shall be returned. But if there are not sufficient means to recover it, what was sold shall remain with the purchaser until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and the property shall be returned. If resident aliens among you prosper, and if any of your kin fall into difficulty with one of them, and sell themselves to an alien, or to a branch of the alien's family, after they have sold themselves, they shall have the right of redemption. None of their brothers may redeem them, or their uncle... One of their brothers may redeem them, or their uncle's son may redeem them, or anyone of their family who is of their own flesh may redeem them. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. They shall compute with the purchaser the total from the year when they sold themselves to the alien until the Jubilee year. The price of the sale shall be applied to the number of years. The time they were with the owner shall be rated as the time of a hired labourer. If many years remain, they shall pay for their redemption in proportion to the purchase price, and if few years remain until the Jubilee year, they shall compute thus. According to the years involved, they shall make payment for their redemption. As a labourer hired by the year, they shall be under the alien's authority, who shall not, however, rule with harshness over them in your sight. And if they have not been redeemed in any of these ways, they and their children with them shall go free in the Jubilee year. For to me the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Quite a lot to unpick there, but what is particularly important in this is getting our modern heads into this strange ancient world in which all land is essentially a gift from God, on loan from God, and the land that is given to the people kind of belongs to them forever. So even if you are bankrupted and you have to sell yourself or your land, essentially your family still has a claim to it and should redeem it, should buy it back, because it still belongs to you and the family line. So there's a person called a Goel, which is a sort of a kinsman redeemer. That is someone in your family who is responsible for essentially buying back you or your land. The other thing is, of course, the idea of the Year of Jubilee. So essentially, there's sort of mini jubilees every sort of 7 years, in line with the 7 days of creation. So on the seventh day, the sort of the rest, the completeness kind of things being sort of straight. But the jubilee itself is 7 times 7, that perfect number 7. Multiplied by itself to give you 49. So essentially the Jubilee is the 50th year, 50th year. And at that point, that is the big sabbatical year, if you like, where all things are put right and all things are given back. So if you can wait that long, then all will be put right even without your Goel. But there we are. So we know that it was beautifully constructed, the book. It's full of literary motifs and clever little bits and bobs. Amongst that is the structure, which is clearly laid out. We've been left with this sort of 4-chapter version of Ruth, and actually that fits very well with a simple structure of how you might break down the book. Chapter 1 tells how Elimelech's family moved to Moab and later returned to Israel. Chapter 2 tells us of the events in the fields where Ruth gleans with the servants of Boaz back in Israel. Chapter 3 is the scene where Ruth meets with Boaz on his threshing floor. And then chapter 4, we move the scene to the city gate, where the legal matters are settled. Chapters 2 and 3 follow the patterns of Ruth and Naomi making a plan and Boaz showing favour to Ruth. They both follow that pattern. The first and last chapters correspond because they tell of leaving home and of death, and then of returning home and of life. The structure is therefore ABBA, which is what's called a chiasm. You find it all over the Old Testament. Chapters 2, 3 and 4 are also chiastic in themselves, but I'm not going to get into that at the moment. So the book has been skillfully composed. Now we're going to talk about some of the literary devices, one of which being the numbers in Ruth, which again sort of adds to the argument of this being very carefully constructed. I mean, some people have said they think the genealogy was added at a later date, but the counter argument is that it all leads up to that genealogy, and that makes sense to me. It has to be said. And I think there's so rarely any mistakes with what is put in or how it's constructed. But anyway, here we go. So the numbers, the important numbers are 3 and 7. These are, as we know, really sort of perfect numbers in biblical terms, and multiples of those. So, for example, the name Naomi is used 21 times in the book of Ruth, 3 times 7. The words Bethlehem, Moab, and Moabites, they occur 7 times. Judah occurs 3 times. In Boaz's oath later on, as the Lord lives, the numerical value of those words, very briefly, numerology is essentially where a letter of the alphabet is appointed a number. So in the Hebrew, as the Lord lives, that those letters make the numerical value of 18. And that is exactly the same number of times the name of God appears in the book, as the Lord lives, and the number of times the name of God appears in the book. And God is invoked in prayer 7 times. There's also a huge number of opposites in the book, quite deliberately set alongside each other. So, for example, famine and plenty, barrenness, fruitfulness, old age and youth, isolation, community, reward, punishment, male, female, death, life, possibly tradition or traditional, and innovation. And as is often the case, the names are very significant in themselves, the names of people and the names of places. People at that time were very often given names which were deliberately supposed to mean something, but whether these are real people or these are people that the storyteller has created for us, I leave that to you to work out. But, for example, Elimelech means my God is king. And, of course, as I said, the book leads up to the fact that Ruth is the grandmother of King David. We could also take it that Elimelech is a very pious man. Perhaps he's very religious. My God is king is his name. They come from Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread, or maybe the sort of the granary, if you like. So associations there, not only with the harvest, but with sort of fertility and things like that. Which, of course, makes it even more interesting when we start the story and we're in Bethlehem, which has no bread. Naomi means gracious or pleasant. At some point in the story, she asks that she's not called that, but rather Mara, meaning bitter. The 2 men who are the daughters of Naomi who marry the Moabite women, Mahlon and Chilion. Those names mean sick and weak, so we might not be surprised at their fate. Orpah is trickier. It's got something to do, we think, with the back of the neck, the nape of the neck, which could be to do with beauty and beauty ideals at the time. It could be to do with the direction of her turning in the story. Hard to say. Ruth means friend or abundant in water, but certainly a very positive name. Boaz means strength. That could be metaphorical, but it could also he may be a sort of a military man or something like a warrior. It's quite possible. And then the baby that is born at the end, Obed, means servant, possibly sort of servant of the Lord. What is true is that the names are real sort of Canaanite names, for the time, so they're historically accurate. Well, I think that is probably enough background to keep us going and to prepare us for the next session, which will be Chapter 1. Thanks very much for listening.